Hi, my name is Stanley, and this is Old Money Life. Now I want you to imagine for a moment that you could trace a single family's fingerprints across nearly every chapter of American history. Not just the glittering parts either, the dark chapters, the ones historians use to quietly footnote and move on from. We're talking about a family so deeply woven into the fabric of this nation that an Ivy League university literally bears their name. A family that helped build America's economy on the backs of enslaved human beings. And then, rather brilliantly if you'll forgive the dark irony, use that same money to fund the institutions we now associate with enlightenment, education, and moral progress. That family is the Browns of Providence, Rhode Island, and this is their story. The Brown family origin story. To understand how the Brown family became one of the most powerful dynasties in American history, you have to go back to the very beginning. Back to a time when America wasn't yet America, when the colonies were still finding their feet, when fortunes were raw and unpolished, and when the rules of commerce were being written in real time by whoever had the audacity to write them. The story begins with James Brown, the patriarch who arrived in Providence, Rhode Island in the early 1700s. Now, Providence in the 1700s was not the sleepy New England city you might picture today. It was a scrappy, ambitious port town, the kind of place where a man with a sharp eye for opportunity and a complete indifference to moral complexity could build something extraordinary. Providence sat at the mouth of the Narragansett Bay, which meant it had direct access to the Atlantic Ocean and, by extension, to the entire machinery of global colonial trade. James Brown established himself as a merchant and trader, laying the groundwork for what his sons would later transform into something far grander. He built connections, cultivated relationships with other Providence merchants, and quietly accumulated enough capital and social standing to give his children a genuine running start. In the world of old money, this is often how it works. The first generation scratches and claws. The second generation builds. The third generation inherits a name that already opens doors before they've even knocked. James had 4 sons: Nicholas, John, Joseph, and Moses. And if you think having 4 ambitious, competitive, enormously driven sons, all pointed in the same direction, sounds like a recipe for either extraordinary success or spectacular family drama, well, you'd be right on both counts. We'll get to that. When James died in 1739, his brother Obadiah stepped in to help guide the family business. And it was under Obadiah's mentorship that the eldest son Nicholas truly began to find his footing. Nicholas was methodical, careful, the kind of businessman who understood that sustainable wealth is built on relationships and reputation as much as on raw transactions. He expanded the family's trading operations, deepened their networks, and crucially began positioning the Browns not just as local merchants, but as players in the broader Atlantic economy. By the 1750s, the Brown family was already among Providence's most prominent families. They owned a candle manufacturing business, one of the most lucrative industries in colonial New England, given the era's near total dependence on spermaceti candles for light. They traded in rum, molasses, and dry goods. They had ships, they had capital, they had connections reaching from Newport to London to the Caribbean. But here is where the story takes its darkest and most consequential turn. Because as the Brown brothers grew older and more ambitious, they looked at the trading networks around them and identified the single most profitable commodity in the entire Atlantic economy. Not spices, not silk, not rum or molasses or any of the goods that filled their warehouses. Human beings. Enslaved African men, women, and children, transported across the ocean in conditions of almost unimaginable horror, and sold into a lifetime of forced labor in the American South and the Caribbean plantations. The Browns did not invent the slave trade. Let's be clear about that. The transatlantic slave trade had been operating for well over 2 centuries by the time the Brown brothers turned their attention to it. But what the Browns did, with the same methodical commercial precision they applied to everything else, was industrialize their participation in it. They treated it as a business problem to be optimized. And in doing so, they helped entrench slavery as the economic backbone of early American prosperity. The 4 brothers and the rise of an empire. Now, before we go any further, I think it's worth pausing to actually introduce you to these 4 brothers properly. Because one of the genuinely fascinating things about the Brown family story is that these four men, raised in the same household, shaped by the same values and the same Providence upbringing, ended up representing almost every possible position a wealthy colonial American could take on the question of slavery, which tells you something important about the era, and something even more important about how money has a way of clarifying, or in some cases conveniently blurring, a person's moral convictions. Nicholas Brown was the eldest, and in many ways the most traditionally minded of the brothers. He was a consensus builder, someone who preferred to keep the family operating as a unit rather than charging off in independent directions. Nicholas understood that the Brown name was itself a form of capital, something to be protected and cultivated as carefully as any financial asset. John Brown was the one who would have fit right in on Wall Street today. Aggressive, visionary, utterly convinced of his own judgment, and remarkably unbothered by the ethical implications of his business decisions. John was the brother who pushed hardest into the slave trade, who saw it most clearly as a commercial opportunity, and pursued it most relentlessly. He was also, not coincidentally, the brother who accumulated the most spectacular personal wealth. His mansion in Providence, the one that still stands today and is open to the public as a museum, is one of the finest examples of Georgian architecture in America. John Brown was not a man who lived modestly. Joseph Brown was the intellectual of the family. Less consumed by commerce than his brothers, Joseph had genuine interests in science, architecture, and what we would today call civic life. He designed buildings. He tinkered with scientific instruments. He was the brother most likely to be found in conversation about ideas rather than prices. That said, Joseph was no innocent bystander to the family business. He benefited thoroughly from the fortune that slave trading helped build, and his beautiful designs were realized with money that bore the stain of that trade. And then there was Moses. Moses Brown is perhaps the most complicated figure in this entire story, which is saying something given the competition. Moses started his adult life as a full participant in the family's commercial enterprises, including its involvement in the slave trade. He was a successful merchant, a respected Providence citizen, a man very much of his class and time. And then something happened to Moses Brown that doesn't happen to enough people in positions of power and privilege. He changed his mind. Genuinely, profoundly, at great personal and financial cost, changed his mind. But we'll come back to Moses. His story deserves its own chapter. Together, the four brothers operated as a kind of commercial collective in the 1750s and 1760s, pooling resources, sharing risk, and coordinating their various business ventures under the umbrella of Nicholas Brown and Company. This arrangement gave them the kind of diversified strength that individual merchants simply couldn't match. When one venture struggled, the others could absorb the impact. When opportunities arose, they could move quickly and with significant capital behind them. Their businesses at this point spanned an almost dizzying range of activities. The Spermaceti Candle Works, which I mentioned previously and which sounds considerably less glamorous than it actually was, given that Spermaceti candles were essentially the premium luxury product of the era, the equivalent of a high-end consumer goods brand today. Iron manufacturing, rum distilling, real estate, shipbuilding, and ownership. And threading through all of it, financing and supplying it, making the margins work when they otherwise wouldn't, the slave trade. It is worth understanding just how central the slave trade was, not merely to the Brown family fortune specifically, but to the Providence economy generally, and to the broader New England economy that is so often romanticized as the virtuous counterpart to the slaveholding South. The North's hands were not clean. They were simply further removed from the plantation. Northern merchants like the Browns supplied the ships, the rum used to purchase enslaved people on the African coast, the financing, the insurance. They took their profit at the beginning and the end of the chain and told themselves, when they told themselves anything at all, that they were merely traders, merely businessmen, merely responding to market demand. This is the story of how one of America's most venerated dynasties was built, not on pluck and ingenuity alone, though those were present too, but on a foundation of human suffering so vast, it beggars comprehension. The triangle trade and the mechanics of profit. I want to take a moment here to explain exactly how the transatlantic slave trade worked as a financial instrument, because I think there's a tendency to understand it in purely moral terms. which is entirely appropriate, but to miss the cold commercial logic that made it so attractive to men like the Brown brothers. Understanding that logic is essential to understanding why it persisted as long as it did, and why families of genuine intelligence and, in some cases, genuine civic virtue participated in it without apparent crisis of conscience. The triangle trade was, from a purely mechanical standpoint, an elegantly designed system of interlocking profit centers. It worked like this. A merchant like John Brown would outfit a ship in Providence or Newport with a cargo of rum, manufactured goods, and other trade items. That ship would sail to the west coast of Africa, where the rum and goods would be exchanged for enslaved African people, typically in transactions with African intermediaries who conducted raids on neighboring communities to capture people for sale. The ship would then undertake the Middle Passage, the nightmarish transatlantic crossing, during which enslaved people were packed into conditions designed to maximize the number of bodies that could fit in a hold, with predictably catastrophic consequences for human survival. The ship would arrive in the Caribbean or the American South, sell the surviving enslaved people, take on a cargo of sugar, molasses, or other plantation products, and return to New England to begin the cycle again. At every point in this triangle, there was profit to be extracted: the markup on trade goods sold in Africa, the markup on enslaved people sold in the Americas, the markup on plantation commodities sold in New England. And because the Browns operated their own ships, they also captured the freight revenue that would otherwise have gone to independent carriers. Vertical integration in the service of atrocity, if you want to put it that way. The return on investment for a successful slave trading voyage was extraordinary by the standards of any other commercial venture available to a colonial New England merchant. We're talking about profit margins that could reach 50% or higher on a single voyage. Compare that to the margins available in dry goods trading, or even in the profitable candle business, and you begin to understand the pull. Now, the Browns were not the largest slave traders in the colonies. That distinction belongs to merchants in Newport, Rhode Island, which was the single most active slave trading port in colonial North America, a fact that tends to surprise people who associate Rhode Island with Roger Williams and religious tolerance and other agreeable things. But the Browns were significant players, and more importantly, even when they were not directly trading in enslaved people, their entire commercial ecosystem was financed by and dependent upon the broader slave economy. The molasses that fed their rum distillery came from Caribbean plantations worked by enslaved people. The cotton that would later fuel their textile mills was picked by enslaved hands in the American South. There was no clean money in the Brown family ledger. There was only money that was more or less directly traceable to the source. By the 1760s, Nicholas Brown and Company was among the most powerful commercial enterprises in New England. The family was wealthy, respected, and positioned at the very center of Providence's social and political life. They were exactly the kind of family that got things named after them, which, as it turns out, is precisely what happened. The Dark Voyage of the Sally. If there is a single episode in the Brown family's history that crystallizes the full moral horror of their involvement in the slave trade, it is the Voyage of the Sally in 1764. And I have to be honest with you, this chapter is not easy to write, and I suspect it will not be easy to read, but it is essential, because what happened aboard the Sally is not a footnote, it is the story. In 1764, the four Brown brothers jointly outfitted a ship called the Sally for a slave trading voyage to the west coast of Africa. The Sally was captained by a man named Esek Hopkins, who would later go on to become the first commander-in-chief of the Continental Navy, which tells you something about how thoroughly the slave trade was woven into the lives of colonial America's most respected citizens. The ship departed Providence carrying a cargo of rum and trade goods to be exchanged for enslaved people on the African coast. The Sally arrived on the African coast and took on a cargo of 196 enslaved people. What followed was catastrophic even by the brutal standards of the Middle Passage. Shortly after departing the African coast, the enslaved people aboard the Sally staged a revolt. The revolt was suppressed by the crew with lethal force. In the aftermath, the conditions aboard the ship deteriorated horrifically. Disease swept through the hold. People starved. People died of despair, as much as physical illness. By the time the Sally reached the Caribbean, approximately 100 of the 196 enslaved people who had boarded the ship were dead. Some had been killed in the revolt and its suppression. Others had died of disease. Others had thrown themselves overboard rather than endure what was being done to them. The surviving enslaved people were sold in Barbados and Antigua. The Browns received their payment. Captain Hopkins filed his report, and the voyage of the Sally was logged in the family's account books as a financial disappointment because the death toll had been too high to maximize profit. I want to let that sink in for a moment. The official assessment of a voyage on which approximately 100 human beings died was that it had been financially suboptimal. The reaction of the Brown brothers to the Sally's disastrous voyage was not uniform, and this is where the story begins to fracture in ways that would define the family for generations. John Brown absorbed the loss, recalibrated, and continued his involvement in the slave trade. He was undeterred. For John, the Sally was a business setback, nothing more. Moses Brown's reaction was entirely different. By some accounts, Moses was already deeply troubled by the family's slave trading activities before the Sally voyage. By others, the Sally was a specific catalyst, the moment when the abstract commerce of the trade became impossible to ignore in its human reality. Either way, the Sally marked a turning point for Moses Brown, one that would eventually lead him to a position so dramatically opposed to his brothers that it would rupture the family in ways that no amount of shared prosperity could fully repair. Moses Brown's awakening, and what it cost. In 1773, Moses Brown's wife Anna underwent a religious conversion that drew her into the Society of Friends, the Quakers, a religious community that was at that time one of the only organized groups in colonial America taking a principled, consistent stand against slavery. Anna's conversion preceded Moses's own by a matter of months. By 1774, Moses Brown had himself become a Quaker, freed the enslaved people he personally held, and renounced his involvement in the slave trade entirely. Now, I want to be careful here not to turn Moses Brown into a saint, because he was not one. His conversion came late, after he had already profited extensively from the slave economy. The enslaved people he freed were freed after years of unpaid labor that had contributed materially to his fortune. His moral awakening did not come with a check in the mail to the people his family had wronged. Repentance in the 18th century, as in the 21st, had a way of stopping short of actual financial restitution. But what Moses did next was genuinely remarkable and genuinely costly, and deserves acknowledgement. Moses Brown became one of the leading abolitionist voices in New England. He lobbied the Rhode Island legislature for restrictions on the slave trade. He helped found the Providence Society for abolishing the slave trade. And in 1797, he did something that must have made for extraordinarily uncomfortable family dinners. He helped bring a federal prosecution against his own brother John for violating the Slave Trade Act of 1794, which prohibited American citizens from participating in the transatlantic slave trade. John Brown was prosecuted, he was convicted, he was fined. And in the way of powerful men who get fined rather than imprisoned for their crimes, he essentially shrugged and continued about his business because the fine was a fraction of what the trade had made him, and because Providence in the 1790s was not a place where a man of John Brown's standing faced serious consequences for the right category of wrong. Moses persisted anyway. He continued his abolitionist work until his death in 1836 at the age of 97, which, by the way, is a lifespan so extraordinary for the era that it seems almost like a narrative joke. The man who freed himself from the family's darkest legacy outlived nearly everyone. There's probably a metaphor in there somewhere. The rupture between Moses and John was never fully healed. The two men who had once been partners in the same commercial enterprise ended their lives as representatives of opposite poles of one of the defining moral arguments in American history. John Brown, who died in 1883, left behind a fortune built on slave trading and an unapologetic legacy as one of the most aggressive commercial minds of his generation. Moses Brown left behind an abolitionist legacy and a textile industry. Yes, a textile industry. We'll get to that. Brown University and the laundering of legacy. Here is where we need to talk about something that old money families have understood instinctively for centuries, and that the Browns practiced with a kind of masterful, almost admirable precision: the relationship between wealth, philanthropy, and the careful construction of a respectable public legacy. In 1764, the same year the Sally embarked on its catastrophic voyage, the Browns were involved in securing a colonial charter for a new institution of higher education in Rhode Island. The College of Rhode Island, as it was originally known, needed a home, and the Brown family was instrumental in bringing it to Providence rather than to any of the other Rhode Island towns competing for the honor. Nicholas Brown, in particular, played a central role in this effort, leveraging the family's connections and political influence to deliver the institution to Providence. The college struggled financially for years after its founding, as new educational institutions in colonial America tended to do. And then, in 1794, Nicholas Brown's nephew, also named Nicholas Brown, made a donation to the institution so substantial that the trustees renamed the college in his honor. The College of Rhode Island became Brown University, just like that. A family name that had been built in significant part on slave trading now graced the gates of one of America's most prestigious educational institutions. I am not suggesting, to be absolutely clear, that the donation was made cynically as a calculated act of legacy laundering. Nicholas Brown the Younger may have been a genuinely philanthropic man who cared deeply about education. The two things are not mutually exclusive. What I am suggesting is that this is how old money works. Fortunes built in darkness are made respectable through association with light. A university, a hospital wing, a concert hall, a scholarship fund. The name persists, gradually detached in the public imagination from its origins, until the university and the slave ship occupy entirely separate mental categories, even though they were financed by the same ledger. Brown University itself grappled seriously with this history in 2006, when a Committee on Slavery and Justice, established by the university's then president, Ruth Simmons, herself, a descendant of enslaved people, published a landmark report examining the institution's historical ties to slavery. The report, which we'll return to in a later chapter, was remarkable for its honesty. It did not whitewash. It did not minimize. It named names and traced money and acknowledged uncomfortable truths in a way that was genuinely unusual for an institution with so much invested in its own prestige. But in 1794, none of that reckoning was on the horizon. What was on the horizon was a Brown family name, freshly attached to an Ivy League institution, gaining with every passing year the kind of cultural gravity that makes people stop asking where the money came from. The oldest trick in the old money playbook, and executed, it must be said, to perfection. The Industrial Revolution and the Second Fortune. Now, here is the part of the story where Moses Brown, the repentant Quaker abolitionist, accidentally becomes one of the founding fathers of American industrial capitalism. I told you he was complicated. In 1789, a young English textile worker named Samuel Slater arrived in New York carrying something more valuable than any cargo the Brown family had ever shipped across the Atlantic. In his head, memorized in defiance of British laws specifically designed to prevent the export of industrial knowledge, Slater carried the complete technical specifications for Richard Arkwright's water-powered cotton spinning machinery. The machinery that was at that very moment transforming Britain from an agrarian economy into the world's first industrial superpower. Slater had heard that American entrepreneurs were offering rewards for anyone who could help replicate British textile technology in the United States. He made contact with a New York merchant named William Dewar, but it was Moses Brown and his son-in-law, William Olney in Providence, who ultimately struck a deal with Slater and put his knowledge to work. In 1793, Moses Brown and William Olney provided the financing and organizational infrastructure. Slater provided the technical knowledge, and together they opened the first successful water-powered cotton spinning mill in America, in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, just a few miles from Providence. Slater Mill, as it became known, was the opening shot of the American Industrial Revolution. Within a generation, the Blackstone River Valley of Rhode Island and Massachusetts was blanketed with textile mills, and America had begun its transformation from a colonial agrarian economy to an industrial powerhouse. And sitting at the very origin point of all of it, with his name on the financing ledger, was Moses Brown, the Quaker abolitionist who had freed his enslaved workers and prosecuted his own brother for slave trading. The irony, and I'm sorry, but it is too perfect not to note, is that the American textile industry that Moses Brown helped create was entirely dependent on cotton, and cotton in the late 18th and early 19th centuries was grown almost exclusively on southern plantations by enslaved people. The slavery that Moses Brown had renounced in its most direct form, the buying and selling of human beings, had simply been moved one step further back in the supply chain. The mills of Rhode Island consumed the labor of enslaved people as surely as the slave ships had transported them. The money was still dirty. It had merely changed its smell. This is not to say that Moses Brown's abolitionism was meaningless or cynical. The abolition of the transatlantic slave trade was a genuine moral achievement, and Moses Brown's contribution to that achievement was real. But it is to say that the Brown family fortune, in its second great incarnation as industrial capital, rested on the same foundation as its first, enslaved labor, just at a greater geographic remove. The textile industry made the descendants of the Brown family extraordinarily wealthy all over again. The Almy and Brown firm, as the partnership was known, expanded rapidly. New mills were built, new rivers were harnessed. New workers, many of them children, which is its own dark chapter we don't have time for today, were recruited from the surrounding countryside. The American Industrial Revolution was underway, and the Browns were once again at the center of it. By the early 19th century, the Brown family fortune had successfully navigated one of the most difficult transitions any dynastic wealth faces: the shift from one economic era to the next. The slave trade era gave way to the industrial era, and the Browns moved with it, shedding the most publicly indefensible aspects of their commercial history while retaining the capital those activities had generated. The money endured, the methods changed. The family name remained attached to a university that polished it year by year into something respectable. The fortune today and the reckoning. So, where does all of this end up? What became of the Brown family fortune, the family itself? And what does it mean in the 21st century to be the inheritor of a legacy this tangled and this dark? The honest answer is that the Brown family as a distinct dynastic unit gradually dissolved across the 19th and 20th centuries. Unlike the Vanderbilts, who concentrated their wealth into a series of spectacular public gestures before eventually spending themselves into relative obscurity, the Browns became diffuse. The fortune branched and spread through marriages and generations until the direct line between specific living person and the merchant house of Nicholas Brown and Company becomes genuinely difficult to trace. No single living heir carries the full weight of the legacy the way Athena Onassis carried the Onassis fortune, or Hugh Grosvenor carries the Grosvenor estate. What did not dissolve was the institution sitting on College Hill in Providence. Brown University's endowment stands today at over $7 billion. Every dollar of that endowment, every building on that campus, every scholarship bearing the university's name traces a direct line of descent back to the commercial activities of the Brown brothers in the 1750s and 1760s, including, specifically, the slave trade. To its genuine credit, Brown University chose to look this history in the eye rather than quietly avert its gaze. In 2006, University President Ruth Simmons, herself the first African-American president of an Ivy League institution and a descendant of enslaved people, commissioned a landmark slavery and justice report. The committee spent 2 years naming names, tracing money, and producing recommendations that were honest in a way that made a lot of powerful people uncomfortable. Among them, establish a center for the study of slavery and justice, build a permanent memorial to the enslaved people connected to the university's history, and deepen the institution's commitment to the surrounding Providence community. Several of those recommendations have been acted upon. The center exists, the memorial has been developed, but the recommendation that was conspicuously absent from the report, and the action that has conspicuously not followed, is direct financial reparations to the descendants of enslaved people tied to the university's origins. Brown, alongside Harvard, Yale, Georgetown, and nearly every other major American university with colonial roots, has been carefully tiptoeing around that specific conversation for years now. The moral logic is simple enough. The institutional logic, meaning the part where an endowment actually shrinks, turns out to be considerably more complicated. The Browns built something extraordinary out of intelligence, ambition, vision, and the forced, uncompensated labor of human beings who never appeared in the family portraits and never had anything named after them. America's oldest fortune was built on that foundation. The University on the Hill in Providence is the living monument to both halves of that truth. And the question of what we do about that is, one this country is still, 250 years later, working up the courage to answer. And now, as always, I would love to hear from you in the comments, because I think this one genuinely demands a conversation. Where do you stand on the question of institutional reckoning with the legacies of the slave trade? Is Brown University's decision to examine its history honestly enough? Or does honest examination without financial restitution ultimately amount to little more than a very well-researched acknowledgement that something terrible happened? And beyond Brown specifically, are there other American dynasties whose origins in slavery you'd like us to examine here on Old Money Life? We've barely scratched the surface of this history, and I suspect we'll be returning to it. Thanks as always for spending your time with us. Cheers until next time.